and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
With me, Gareth Talent.
In this faintly Christmassy podcast, just to be clear, by the way, there is no Christmas content in this podcast whatsoever. It's just around December, and so therefore we declare it to be Christmassy. But anyway, in this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It is a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, it is another one of our influencers. And given that it's Christmas, we're going to be doing Father Christmas. You can't see this, but I'm looking at Gareth's face, and there was a look of, no, we are not doing Father Christmas.
No, but we're doing the next best thing. We're doing an influencer that is long overdue, and I'm actually very excited about.
So you might be excited. I'm a little nervous because I sort of did the research on this one, and you've done the download, so we're going to talk about Winston Churchill. I think in terms of Winston Churchill, he's one of those leaders that is about as famous as you could possibly be, particularly if you're British. He is one of our most famous, in inverted commas, recent leaders. And so I get very nervous. There'll be people saying, you don't know what you're talking about, whatever information we provide, how we talk about it. Someone says, you don't understand him. And just to be clear, I haven't read his multi-tome autobiography that he's written. So, you'd be right in doing so. I'm also very nervous about, is he going to be another one of these leaders where it turns out he wrote a great story after he died and everyone's fallen into it. So, but you'll be pleased to know this one is another one of those ones where, okay, this is for good reason that he is known as this great leader. And I think actually his story is even more fascinating than the limited amount of information most people know. And as part of my research, I listened to a BBC podcast called Great Lives, where they talked about him for half an hour. And I walked away from that podcast furious at how poor it was, because they told me virtually nothing about Winston Churchill apart from some cliche. So there you go. I've wound myself up. Gareth, at the risk of this being half an hour of the podcast in itself, what do you know about Winston Churchill? Pick a couple of top facts that you know about Winston Churchill.
Yeah, I was going to say, normally when you ask me that, it's somebody I don't really know and I give you the headlines. But obviously, I'm very interested in military history, leadership generally. So I know a reasonable amount about Churchill. But sort of wave tops, of course, is he was a First Sea Lord in the First World War. He was also a battlefield commander in the army in the First World War. He was also, I think, the Minister of Armaments in the First World War.
We could just stop there and say, hang on a minute, how could he be all those things?
Yeah. So I think, I'm not going to talk about the Second World War. I'm not going to talk about post-war, because he came back as Prime Minister, of course. But I think those three things in one war, and I'm sure there was an awful lot more there as well, gives you a sort of sense of a man that is not a leader by default because he rose through the ranks in a particular field, in a particular job, but is a natural leader. I think actually possibly more than some of the other influencers we've done, we can explore how much of that was based on privilege and position, but certainly a character where his own force of nature and traits meant that no matter what he did, he was going to make a name for himself and he was going to do interesting things.
I think you've done a beautiful, we should cut this and put this at the end as a summary, because I think you did really well. I was really interested to find out was he one of these leaders where he had a really good PR team? It turns out he was a bit lucky. He was a bit of an arse, but well done. You did a few good things. This is a three-dimensional leader. And as I was doing the research again and again, I was sort of, he did what? How did he do it? So let's jump in. First thing to say, is happy birthday, Mr. Churchill, because this is pretty much the 150th anniversary of his birth. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but it's
Happy birthday, Winston.
happy birthday, Winston. And how do you know it's his birthday if you haven't done the research? Weirdly, I saw an edition of Country Life magazine somewhere, and on the cover, there was an article about Winston Churchill. Now, admittedly, magazines are going to write about something, but that again struck me, which is Country Life magazine was writing an article about Winston Churchill. That alone tells you the far-ranging impact beyond history nerds of where he is. Winston Churchill was a candidate in the 100 Greatest Britons television series in 2002 on the BBC. It was a television poll to determine who the British people, who they considered the greatest Britons in history. You'll be unsurprised to know he came out at number 1, by the way, but just for my own amusement, I've got to tell you about some of the others. So Princess...
Brunel.
Oh, hang on. I'll tell you where did I write down where Brunel was?
He's got to be on the list.
He was definitely on the list. Number 3 was a rather dubious Princess Diana.
Okay.
Not sure the greatest Britain, but that's fine. By the way, Darwin and Shakespeare with 4 and 5. John Lennon beat Horatio Nelson. That would have been an interesting fight to see, but Lennon was 8.
I feel like Nelson is let down by age rather than greatness.
I think you could be right. And the fact he couldn't write a song to save his life. One of our previous influencers contentiously was at 16, and that's Margaret Thatcher. And in another interesting matchup, Enoch Powell beat Julie Andrews. Enoch Powell was 55, Julie Andrews 59. In a military angle, Johnny Rotten just beat Field Marshal Montgomery. Rotten was 87, Montgomery at 88. And I thought about this, and I think he beat Montgomery, presumably because Johnny Rotten wouldn't have made the mistake of authorizing Operation Market Garden, the failed attempt at Arnhem. So that's obviously why Johnny Rotten. Anyway, I thought
importantly, though, would Johnny Rotten have taken Khan or bypassed?
Difficult to know. I don't know what anarchists do when it comes to invasion of men. Anyway, the point being is that Winston Churchill is clearly recognized by the people of the United Kingdom, even this amount of time, and it's 80 years, or it's not going to be long till it's 100 years after it. He is recognized. And I want to give you the first of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill, and that was, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And of course he did go ahead and write the history. But you get this first idea of someone with a little bit of a twinkle in his eye, which is interesting because we've met lots of ruthless leaders, we've met lots of serious people. This is one who literally was known for how he was joking. And going back to your summary, this is an army officer who saw action in India, the Second Boer War, and the First World War. He was a war correspondent. He was an MP. How long was he an MP for, Gareth?
I was going to say I have no idea. I mean, clearly he was an MP prior to the Second World War, and then he was PM again in 50. Oh,
go on, 50, give me a guess.
And then, so 56. So I'm going to say 20 years.
64 years. He was a member of parliament for 64 years. As you have pointed out, he was the prime minister twice. And some fact that I scribbled down, which you probably are interesting, led the United Kingdom through the Second World War against Nazi Germany, beat the Germans, etc., etc. So even at that high level, you start poking in the different corners. It's very interesting. So let's start with a bit of early life. I tend to spend a bit too much time on early life, but I always wonder what forms these people and whether we can draw anything from that, maybe. So he was born 30th of November, 1874. He was born Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, and he was born to Lord Randolph Churchill and Jenny Jerome. Obviously, Lord Randolph Churchill, landed gentry in the United Kingdom, and Jenny Jerome, wealthy American. And actually, he was born 30 minutes away from where myself and Gareth live in Blenheim Palace. And if you've ever been to Blenheim Palace, it is not a insignificant house. And so it is clear this man was an aristocrat. Let's be under no illusion. He was not a man of the people. He was not middle class. He did not, as it were, work his way through the system. His paternal grandfather was John Spencer Churchill, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, who happened to be appointed Viceroy of India. So if you ever wanted to know what the family was like or where they had come from, that is exactly what it was.
Yeah.
So money, wealthy, landed gentry, people who were already leaders. This is what their family did. They led.
Yeah.
His parents were estranged as he grew up. So the relationship broke down, and he was brought up by his nanny, which I think, again, it's another interesting thing. So there's sort of difficulties in the family. And when she died in 1895, Churchill wrote, "She had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived." So here's a young man who is rich, privileged, but has already started to find some challenges in life and made some interesting friends. Boarding school in Ascot, as you might expect, aged 7. I'm going to say the quote about his academic skills, and you're not going to believe this, Gareth. Quote, "He was not academic and his behavior was poor. I swear we are starting to see a pattern. I'm going to instruct my children to be very poor at school, because apparently the greatest leaders in history typically are poor in school, possibly for different reasons, but I'm going to still tell my kids that."
It's an interesting little segue. I don't think we have the answer to this, but do we think that that is a pattern that we've hit upon because people who aren't necessarily academic have other skills and traits? Or is it that people who go on to be strong characters, and that is, we've already identified, often a requirement for becoming a great leader, they have the confidence not to care? Because those are two
Yes.
subtly different things. Because one would suggest our academic system is perhaps flawed in some way, and the other would suggest that people that go on to be eminent leaders because of force of character, no matter what our academic system would be, would probably still rebel and be difficult.
I think there is a danger that we conflate causation and correlation. However, I do think what you have said has some merit. And I think we have seen time and time again with many of our influencers that they were bored by school, that either it didn't excite them or it wasn't enough of a challenge. And their reaction to that was misinterpreted as, "You're not very good," or "You don't at least measure up to our regular standards." I suspect there are many great leaders who are also very good at school as well. But I do agree with you. We see this time and time again, where some of the leaders that are most perhaps innovative or against the grain, you do see this challenge, which is at school, you would expect them to be brilliant, and it turns out they weren't very good. I think we also have seen this with a couple of the military leaders who you would expect at their military colleges to pass out top. And while some of that has been true, we've seen quite a lot of people who passed out pretty much at the bottom. But then when they were, as it were, given the opportunity to lead in real life, did exceptionally well. So, we've joked about it, but I think there is a salutary lesson, which is standard methods of training or judging people may not be as useful as we think for some people who go on to do incredible things. He started off poorly, but he improved and he went to Harrow. I would imagine he was going to go to Harrow anyway because of his family. But I didn't realize this. Did you know that Harrow had a military form? In other words, there was a part of Harrow that if you wanted to join the military, you went there and did that. So for 3 years, he was in the military form. And the whole point is they were, in inverted commas, breeding military leaders. So He knows he wants to join the military. He knows he has to go there. I can't comment on his day-to-day life in Harrow, but you can see there's a trajectory there. And as we'll see later on, I don't think it was altogether other people's ideas. You get the feeling very quickly he was looking for adventure and excitement, and we'll come back to that. He got into Sandhurst at his second attempt. Again, you know, not first attempt, didn't get in the first time. And he was accepted as a cadet. This is Winston Churchill. What unit did he join, given A, who we know he went on to be, and B, his family? Which military did he
I'm
join?
going to guess he joined the Household Cavalry.
He joined the cavalry in September 1893. February 1895, he is commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. And then the first thing he did, he used his mother's influence to get posted to a war zone. This is a man who not only runs to the sound of guns, he writes letters to influential people to say, have they heard any guns go off recently? And could he go and listen, which I think is fantastic. So do you happen to know the first war zone he went to? This is just magnificent. I feel bad because he was a misogynist. There's many things about him, as we will say, that we'll sort of go, but you've got to admire this guy. So where did he go first?
Was it South Africa?
Was not South Africa.
Right. Where did he go? So where are we? This is going to be
1895.
1895. Afghanistan.
The Cuban War of Independence.
Of course it was.
Of course it was. And so this is a second lieutenant in the Cuban War of Independence to observe, instantly became involved in skirmishes after joining Spanish troops attempting to suppress independence fighters. This is a man who gets stuck in and didn't understand how this happened. And I think there's lots of this about Churchill. He started sending reports to a newspaper in London. He liked writing. He liked this idea of being a journalist and a war reporter. But I don't know how you square that, where you are a second lieutenant and you're a journalist, a war reporter. I suspect it was of its time. So he, within 2 years of joining the army, he's already, as it were, fighting in places he probably shouldn't have done. From there, he goes
Well,
to...
it's interesting. You say he's fighting in places that he probably shouldn't have done. My initial reaction when you said he was writing articles and letters to newspapers as a serving officer in the army, my gut is he's probably fighting in the right places. He's writing reports for the media from the wrong position. And what I mean by that is, if you are an actor in the fight, you can't be a neutral, objective observer. So ultimately, if you are writing for a newspaper to report on what is happening, you're already biased at the very least, if not an agent of state propaganda. I suspect Churchill knew that.
Yes, I was going to say, I suspect if Churchill was sitting next to us, there'd be a twinkle in his eye and say, heavens, boy, I enjoyed myself. And of course, I wrote about the people who were right and wrong and all that kind of stuff. You can see this is stuff that most people haven't heard about, but you can see how he was not a boring politician. He talked about Margaret Thatcher, who you might argue was a boring politician in the sense of, I'm a professional politician, that's what I'm going to do. Anyway, he goes to India, spend 2 years in India, Bombay, Bangalore, and Calcutta. Again, at the end of the 1800s, that is the place to be in the British Empire, and also pretty difficult as well. So he was in where the fighting was, in where the trouble was, and I think he was enjoying it. Religious beliefs, I bring this up because there was a quote from him around this time where he said, I do not accept the Christian or any other form of religious belief. And while he'd been christened in the Church of England, he had quite a big anti-Christian phase and actually was agnostic as an adult. He goes on to say to his cousin in a letter, religion is a delicious narcotic. But the reason why I bring that up is less to be either critical or supportive of his religious stance, is this is a man who is not superstitious. This is a pragmatist who understands how the world works. So the delicious narcotic, that's the kind of thinking, whether you agree with it or not, to one side, that is a leader who says, that's interesting. I understand how this religion thing works.
It's interesting. We're clearly still on quite a young Churchill here, but later on, was he open about being agnostic, or did he, as he was probably more interested in attaining his position as Prime Minister, was he a little bit more cautious about being open about that? Because back then, even in the 1940s, 1950s, it probably would have been a relatively rare thing to be openly agnostic and active in British Parliament.
The honest answer is I don't know, but I can't think of a time when I've heard him being religious. He certainly uses the word God, but I think he uses it in a more generic, high-level way. So I don't know. It's an interesting point. Again, I get the feeling he doesn't really care what people thinks. That's just not, and we've seen this again with other leaders as well. He is not that worried about how people see him. He is busy doing things that define how people see him. So that can be both an excellent trait in a person who is not trying to build a narrative or carefully construct an image. It can also be a terrible thing when you're an idiot and you do stupid things and you say, I don't care because I'm clever than everyone else. In a sense, it's a pretty high risk gambit, but obviously it pays off when people are really good. He has been around the world fighting, and he volunteers for the Malakand Field Force in its campaign against Mohammed rebels in the Swat Valley in the northwest of India. And I believe the Swat Valley is potentially modern day Afghanistan. I could be wrong. But anyway,
Valley is what they call the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas of northern Pakistan.
So all very
modern day, still quite a messy place.
Yeah, that's well said. Now, the reason why I told you about that is I think you've heard enough about his sort of military efforts to date, but most importantly, this is where he wrote his first book. What book do you think he wrote, Gareth?
Oh, his first book, it would be a history of some kind.
It would be a romantic novel.
Of course it was. A
We
Mills
need
and Boone special.
we need to go away and read his romantic novel, because I think he was dabbling. But by the way, he then wrote one about his time in the field force, so that's okay. But no, how interesting. Who knew that Winston Churchill wrote what I presume to be a bodice ripper, although perhaps less bodice ripping, but certainly a novel. But look, again, not a coward. He is a careerist. This is a career soldier doing this. He then uses his contacts again. This is a man who knows how to operate in a network. It's funny, each of these things you can go back to previous episodes we've done and talked about how you create networks, not because you need them now, but when you do need them. He used his contacts and got attached to General Kitchener's campaign in Sudan. And not only was he a subaltern in the 21st Lancers, but again, he's now a journalist for the Morning Post. So he's continuing that. And at that point, he goes on and fights the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. So remember this, it was 1893 he joined. This is a man that's done lots of operations and, of course, clearly has not really been back to the United Kingdom for a long time. So what does he do? He says, well, I think I've done the army now. I'm going to go and start my career. So he's going to go back and he's going to start his political career. But guess what happens in 1898? The Second Boer War. So instead of sailing back to the United Kingdom, he now goes to South Africa to be a journalist. So there's the second thing, journalism, the power of words, the storytelling, but excitingly danger, because he's now in the war. And it's interesting how Churchill appears quietly in many of these famous places of the time that you never really knew he was there. So in October of that year, he travels to Ladysmith, which is the famous Siege of Ladysmith, where the British Army was besieged by Boer troops. And for those of you familiar with the Royal Navy field gun competition, a number of Royal Navy guns were dragged on carriages to relieve the siege of Ladysmith. So he was there and he was involved in all of this. And that was around the time when another very important thing, and if anyone's watched Young Winston, which is a film, it's a very, very good film, at the Battle of Chieveley, I think it's the Battle of Chieveley, which incidentally is a junction on the M4, but this was in South Africa, the South African Chieveley. His train was derailed by Boer artillery shelling. And what happened at that point, Gareth?
Well, I've recently read this story, so I'm not going to spoil the moment for you. But I'm aware that it's a boy's own tale in its own right, and I think we've said this for many of the influencers that we've done. Single stories that are numerous throughout the lives of the people that we're looking at could make entire books or an entire podcast episode in their own right, and this is one of those. So I will let you tell it.
Well, so I will tease you. He was captured and he was a prisoner of war, and he was interned in a POW camp, a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria. And on that bombshell, we're going to take a very quick break. And spoiler alert, we will tell you what happens next. And if you've listened to other influencers episodes, I think you know what happens next. So, Gareth, we'll see everyone straight after this break. Welcome back, everybody. I'm about to tell you what Winston Churchill does as a prisoner of war in Pretoria, but of course, you've listened to a number of our influencers episodes before, and so you know damn well he escapes, because apparently that's what all of our influencers do, is that at some point they escape from a prisoner of war camp. He was in Pretoria in December. He climbs over the prison wall while guards are distracted. And then basically he walks out. He has this rudimentary map. And after several days of avoiding Boer patrols, he makes contact with a British sympathizer, a gentleman called John Howard, who worked at a coal mine in the Transvaal. He was hidden by John Howard in a coal shed for several days. So the future leader of the free world, brackets not including America, hid in a coal shed for several days. And then he was smuggled onto a train that was going towards what's Mozambique today, but very importantly was then known as Portuguese East Africa, which at the time was a neutral territory. So unbelievably, again, in his mid-20s, not in the army, but as a journalist, gets captured, prisoner of war, escapes, as you say, Gareth, boy's own stuff. That's someone who's at the age of 25 to have done this. Everyone's waiting to say, what's he going to do next? So what's he going to do next, Gareth?
Does he go off to find another war?
He does. He joins the army again. He's now a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse Regiment. And actually, I got it wrong. He then goes back to fight as part of the relief of the siege of Ladysmith, and he goes on to take Pretoria as well. And unsurprisingly, he was one of the first British troops in both Ladysmith and Pretoria. I love this. This is a quote from a book. He and his cousin, Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, demands and receives the surrender of 52 Boer prison camp guards. I can just imagine, see here, I demand you surrender. This literally is the definition of the boy's own hero, isn't it? I mean, he's got to be famous. This has got to be people want to learn about. He is an adventurer. You could stop there and he would already be an influencer in terms of his cavalier approach to being in the army, bravery, resourcefulness. Very interesting.
Do we think a cavalier approach is a good thing? Because I mean, the term cavalier approach has negative connotations, doesn't it? But we've just said we could stop there and he would be an influencer. And of course, an influencer doesn't have to be a positive thing, but we are, you and I certainly are lauding the fact that he's an adventurer, that he's an innovator, that he's doing new things. And there is something about ruffling feathers, bucking the system, being different that we admire. And yet we also know that being reckless, being cavalier, being a rebel without a cause is also a disruptive and often negative thing. So I'm just going to square in my own mind where currently in the history of Winston Churchill, where we are, whether we like him or not. And
I
we
like
definitely do. We definitely do. But whether we
I
stick.
like him, but I think you've raised a really important point, and we've talked about different influences like this a lot of the time. So the first thing is, I really like him. Like, this is a great story. If someone wrote a novel about someone like this, you would read the novel and you would be rooting for this person. I have to believe there were many, many people around him that thought he was a horse's ass, and he only got there because his family got him there, and he was a show off and a braggart. And well, it turns out all of these things are true. So going back to your point though about, do we like, and I like that we've used the word cavalier, because I just get the vibe that there was this, how are we going to do it, Winston? Well, I'm just going to climb over the wall. But isn't that dangerous, Winston? Well, we'll see how it goes. I think this idea about being cavalier is analogous to what makes a great leader. You can write it down, and person A can follow that to the letter and be a crap leader that everyone goes, I would not follow that person. And person B follows the same thing, and there's something magical about it. So I don't think there's anything good about being cavalier per se. It's how you're cavalier and when you're cavalier, and frankly, a stack of luck. Because imagine if he'd have tried to escape from that prisoner of war camp with 10 people that had been caught and 9 of them had been executed. That would have been a very bad answer. That would have been a terrible thing he did, but he didn't. So I think I get the feeling is that he can carry this. I don't know. I think we just have to be very careful about being formulaic about what makes a great leader, because we've seen so many of these traits that have made people we don't like as opposed to people we do like. I don't know. What do you
Yes.
think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why I sort of asked the question. I caught myself because I said, do we like him at this point? And of course, we both do, because we're both drawn to this adventure. But I think you said it very well. I'll tell you what I think. Churchill at this point reminds me of Harry Flashman.
I was going to say the word Flashman earlier, and of course, Flashman is very dislikable in a
Harry
sense.
Harry Flashman is a fascinating character, and for the listeners that don't know who Harry Flashman is, an author called George MacDonald Fraser took the school bully from the book Tom Brown's School Days and wrote a series of books about what happened to him after he got kicked out of rugby school. And he goes off and joins the army and then goes around the world being an absolute rogue, a coward. But no matter what happens, he always comes out alive and smelling of roses. And he is a despicable character. I mean, he's a fictitious character, but he rapes women. He beats slaves. He gambles. He steals. He is, on the face of it, a horrible character. But because he's brash and bold and gets into scrapes, and the books are written to be engaging, you end up secretly rooting for Flashman, even though he is a braggart and a cad and a rogue. And I wonder if there's something about Churchill at this stage, and I think maybe this is why, on the face of it, Churchill is, very much a great leader and a great Briton, but there is an undercurrent of controversy. There is some difficulty because, like all people, he is flawed, and circumstance and luck probably aided in the legacy that he created. But I think also those characteristics that, from one lens, are deeply flawed are the same characteristics that, in another light, in another context, are brilliant. and allowed him to do what he did.
You've kind of articulated my fear about doing this today, which is, are we going to say he was a bit of an arse? He did some really bad things, but on the balance, we have to say well done. Actually, you beautifully segued into my next sort of piece, which was throughout the war. So this was the Boer War, obviously. He publicly chastised anti-Boer prejudices. So at the time, hating Boers was a very popular thing to do. These were the enemy. These, frankly, were the enemy that did bad things. These were the beginning. These were the commandos. This is where the term commando comes from. These people went around and did not treat the local populace well, and were sometimes vicious. He called for them to be treated, quote, with generosity and tolerance, and afterwards urged the British to be magnanimous in victory. And we'll come back to some more examples of this. We've had some examples of some people, some influencers, where we've said, well, they were a bit racist, and they said that, they didn't like people and they of this type. And actually, at this point, and maybe this is, I'm reading the wrong things, he's starting to say, actually, he's starting to publicly talk about generosity and being magnanimous in victory and how you treat other people. So that's interesting. One thing I do want to ask you about, though, because I think this is another interesting thing. Many of our influence of that era, and obviously we've picked lots of people from various wars, Rommel, Jackie Fisher, people like that. I wonder whether the military was a useful vehicle for someone to find and develop their leadership skills. And obviously that's logical. That's what a military does, because that's what it needs. But I wonder, do we lack a bit of that today? So if you are a young leader, where do you go to get some of this out of your system, to learn the hard lessons, to lead people? As we've said before, the military, one of the things that is unusual about the military is that it is so extreme in the risks that you take. And I would argue, because the risk to yourself and others is so great, it intensifies that experience. We don't have that now. I mean, obviously you can join the military, but our leaders today, that is not expected of them, whereas perhaps then. What do you think? Do you think the military played a big part in leadership?
Yeah, certainly historically it has. The first son inherited the estate, the second son joined the military, the third son joined the clergy. That kind of was a sort of trope, but how the landed gentry, behaved. And I think it probably did have quite a big impact in widening people's perspectives, putting them in experiences that they wouldn't perhaps have been in, seeing the world. And I think historically, of course, it was very difficult to travel. And so, unless you were literally an explorer, a sailor, or a soldier, you probably wouldn't really go far beyond Europe. So it probably did shape a lot of wider leaders. I think that is less common today, as a career in the military isn't a stepping stone into politics or business. But I think more interestingly, perhaps, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine fairly recently about what we value in military leaders and what we value in peacetime. And then more recently, we have started to talk again about, and you will have seen it in the media, how the British military is perhaps not as ready as it should be or could be for another hard power contest in Europe. And we were talking about whether traits that are extremely valuable in a conflict, in a warfighting situation, and therefore the people that show those traits or go looking for those traits, and I think Churchill has shown that he was that kind of person, are perhaps undervalued in a peacetime army. In a wartime army, those are incredibly valuable things. In a peacetime army, they are seen as a bit disruptive, perhaps even at times a bit toxic. And we were having a conversation about where the balance is and whether we've got the balance right. And I think from my experience, working in the military up until quite recently, I think there's been some really progressive steps forward to change some of the quite negative behaviours. But I also think maybe we've lost some of the edge.
Is it not that we're looking for the balance between a wartime and a peacetime leader? Because by definition, if we're finding the middle ground, they are neither a great peacetime leader nor a great wartime leader. Are we looking for the time and way to transition? And we talked about this before, in fact, I think a couple of episodes ago, which is understanding where you are and planning for that. So we were talking about how does a military create doctrine for disruption. And
Yeah.
as we were talking about this, I remember at the time you gave me a slightly quizzical look, which is no, but disruption just happens. I'm misquoting you, and my statement was, well, it kind of does, and when the situation occurs, you allow it. The step before that, though, is what if you were so clever, you had thought about this and you created an environment where you said, now is the time for me to create this disruption. And here is the most effective and efficient way to kickstart that. In
Yes.
the same way here, rather than we need to find people who are good in both situations, how do we find a way to say, I mean, this is ridiculous because it's so hard. How do you find a way for a country to say, last year we needed a good peacetime leader, today we need a wartime leader, and therefore we're going to have an election, and here are the things we look for? It's really difficult.
It is really difficult, but I think you've just said it very, very well, which is what you don't want is somebody who's the balance of a bit of both and not good at either. Because what you end up with there is, somebody who probably has the worst of both traits. What I think you articulated extremely well, though, is that whilst I do believe disruption is something that is an external force, as an internal organisation, whether that's a nation looking for a leader, whether that's an organisation in business, or whether it's a military, you can absolutely plan ahead for change, even
Yeah.
if you don't know what that change is. And I was actually dealing with a client today when we were talking about exactly that. And we were talking about the fact that in your deliberate process of planning for the future, you can build into that an expectation that some of your capacity, some of your resources are going to get used in unexpected ways. And in the military, we used to call it contingency planning. But you can absolutely do it, and you absolutely should do it. And I think there's a point here, getting back to this idea of Churchill and whether through some lenses traits are seen as very, very positive and incredibly useful in particular contexts, and viewed through a different lens and in a different context, they're very much the opposite. And they're seen as negative traits. You can't just switch from a peacetime to a wartime leader in the same way you can't just switch the culture of an organization to be in deliberate planning to crisis mode. It is a cultural shift, and that takes some time. So it's interesting, and I think we're perhaps going to go through Churchill's sort of rise up to the late 1930s, and we can see how that cultural shift happened. And I'd be interested to see whether he was a particularly contentious figure until the moment came and then everybody fell in line.
Yeah, spoiler alert, of course, he was hugely contentious. Everyone thought he was an arse until everyone said, obviously, I thought he was brilliant.
Yeah.
Um, by the way, last thing to say, because I think that little segue into what makes good leaders, and in this case, wartime, peacetime, again, we have to be really careful because, of course, luck rolls her dice, and you get a man called Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, this idea of, well, of course, he's not a military leader. Actually, he turns out to be an amazing military leader as far as we can
Yeah.
tell. So anyway, the point is, if you read a self-help book and think, I am now going to be a great leader because I've read a self-help book, I can tell you, you probably are not going to be a great leader. That's the great leaders have not read self-help books and decided from there they're great. So anyway, let's get back to Winston, and let's just because before we finish off this episode, let's roll up maybe to the First World War. So it's 1900 now. God blimey, he's already lived a life. He now has entered Parliament. He is a Conservative MP right until 1904 when he switches to the Liberal Party. I love that. And by the way, he switches again later on, just to be clear. This is not a man who is tied by past actions. Here's another thing which I had not heard about Churchill before. I gave the quote about his view on how to treat the Boers and how to be magnanimous in victory.
Yeah.
Really interesting. There is in 1904 there is a proposed aliens bill. Now sit down and just hold on to yourself, because you will never have heard of anything like this before in your life. There was an aliens bill to curb Jewish immigration. I know, the idea that people in Parliament would write bills to prevent terrible immigration because those Jewish people, I know they're having a difficult time, but let's, there's no room in the country, that kind of thing. Anyway, that was happening. And he stated, quote, "This bill would appeal to insular prejudice against foreigners, racial prejudice against Jews." And he expressed himself in favor of the old, tolerant and general practice of free entry and asylum to which this country has so long adhered to and from which it has so greatly gained. And I wrote that one down just because I'm a miserable bugger, and says, funny, you don't see the same people saying how bloody wonderful Winston was. Many of those people, perhaps on the right of the political spectrum these days, don't hear them using that quote very much. I'll remind you, the old, tolerant and generous practice of free entry and asylum to which this country has so long adhered to and from which it has so greatly gained. There's leadership there, not a popular statement. He is, to some degree, it was quite surprising. I could imagine he, from the landed gentry, well, we've been generous for many years, but now it's enough. That was really interesting, I felt.
I'm aware we are running out of time for this episode, but it's interesting how characters from history get archetyped, stereotyped, and become a poster child of something that they're absolutely not.
They are adopted and they are appropriated. He is a great Englishman, and therefore I want to imply that he agreed with these things. So
he looked like a bulldog.
I looked like a bulldog, British flag, cigar, great Ireland. So, but you're right, which is, it's so interesting. But there's a nuance there which I had not heard. If you'd have said to me, he said, the Jews have always been a problem in Europe, or we've had enough, you wouldn't have surprised me, and we'd have said, well, it was of his time. That would have been an unpopular stance.
I wonder whether that's because there is so much history, there is so much legacy for Churchill, that it's easy for both the left and the right to pick and choose the bits that they want to characterize him in whatever way they want. So it's probably also quite easy to pick and choose the bits that make him look like a misogynist, a racist, a xenophobe.
And honestly, potentially these quotes are sort of cherry picked. Although he's known as a radical. What a surprise. You can imagine from the quotes we've heard. He became the Under Secretary of State for the Colonial Office. He actually requested that. And one of his first things he talked about was relations between European settlers and the Black African population. Here's a man who's experienced it and cares about it. And after the Zulus launched their Bambata Rebellion, Churchill complained about the disgusting butchery of the natives by Europeans. This is not a racist, I don't think. I can't help thinking the variety of travel has helped. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are many other military officers who felt the opposite, but that was interesting.
I knew about his sort of colourful history and sense of adventure and all that sort of stuff. But I genuinely thought we were going to have conversations about him. He was of his time. He
Yep.
held these views,
Yep.
and yeah, it's interesting that he's quite, and whether he's cherry picked or not, we don't know, but quite outspoken about, like you say, unpopular views that are founded not because they're contentious, not because they're popular, but because they're what he thinks is right, based on an experience set that most people don't have. And that's
I
got
think,
nothing to do with privilege or money. That's
yeah,
got to do with the life that he's lived up until that point.
also courage of his convictions. This is
Yeah,
clearly a man who was not afraid, so he says. Gets married in 1908 to Clementine Hosier, his beloved wife, and she stayed with him throughout his life. Okay, we've been very nice to him so far. At Boy's Own Hero, hooray for Churchill. In April 1909, they were looking for funding for some reforms, and there was a policy that was being pushed for naval expansion, and Churchill denounced that. Quote, refusing to believe war with Germany was inevitable. Okay, in that case, that is cherry picked, not necessarily a great call.
interesting. That is effectively the other half of the argument to when we did Jackie Fisher.
And he's saying on the other side of the Atlantic, no, we shouldn't,
We
because
might have, and it's fascinating because at the time when we did Jackie Fisher, we talked about the fact that if he had been listened to, caveat it with counterfactual histories are always dangerous and speculative, but there is a logical deduction to say the First World War could have been avoided. So perhaps in a very overly simplistic interpretation, we could say that Churchill had a hand in the fact that the First World War happened when it could have been avoided, and yet he's best remembered as the wartime leader that saved the country from Nazi tyranny in the Second World War.
interesting, isn't it? Definitely a point here about let's make it clear great leaders don't always get it right. We'll
Yeah,
come back to that. He might have a few more little faux pas as it were. 1910, he is promoted to Home Secretary. So at the age of 36, I haven't looked into this, but my guess is that that is a pretty young Home Secretary. Even now, that would be a young Home Secretary. Then I would imagine he didn't have a walrus moustache and an enormous top hat. Well, he probably did, but he wasn't one of those old people. And again, he implemented prison reform. Churchill personally commuted 21 of the 43 death sentences that were in play at the time while he was Home Secretary. So he's also progressive. He's also looking forward. Um, he is a force for change, whether it be good or bad. He is a force for change. And then in 1910, just before we get to the war, one of the last things he had to deal with was the Tony Pandy riots. And in those riots, the reason why I bring that up is he specifically prevented the use of the military in fighting those riots. And he was accused by the Times and other newspapers of the time of being soft on rioters. Isn't that fascinating how the man that is considered so, strong, forthright fighter, escaped from the Boers, went back to war. He says, no, the military's not going on the streets. We're not doing that. Even though he is then castigated by the press and no doubt the people at the time. What an interesting character beyond the sort of one-dimensional strong leadership. We are, I think, at the end of the first episode. And so I'm going to finish with this because it's a call out to one of your early statements. In October 1911, Churchill is promoted and becomes the First Lord of the Admiralty. So when we come back in the next episode, we're going to pick up, we're going to accelerate a bit, and we're going to talk about what he did as First Lord of the Admiralty and how actually it leads to his demise. or does it lead to his demise? You all know it doesn't, but
I was
honestly,
going to say, spoiler alert, no.
yeah. Winston Churchill, end of the war hero, but it's really interesting. There's all sorts of interesting facts how he got to where he was. So there we go. What we'll do is we'll call it for today. We're going to leave you for a week just to sort of hopefully tempt your interest in coming back and hearing the next story. By the way, just as again as a spoiler, if you thought the first half was interesting, even if you put the stuff aside you know about the Second World War, the second half is just as interesting. So, Gareth, let's come back maybe next week for part 2 of our Churchill Influencers episode. If you have enjoyed this, please subscribe, please like, please do all of those things that apparently you're supposed to do with podcasts. If you've enjoyed this and you've got a friend who, don't tell anyone, is equally nerdy about leadership and management and history, go tap them on the shoulder and say, you should go listen to this Battling with Business thing. Please let us know if we have made an egregious error. Email us on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com, or we are on X @battlingwithbiz. Let us know what you think. Let us know who you'd like to talk about next. But for now, perhaps let's leave you at the end, Churchill's Odyssey Part 1. And hopefully we'll speak to you again next week when we finish off the story of Winston Churchill and his role as one of our greatest influencers.
Amazing. Look forward to it. Cheerio.